Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. So excited to be with y'all today. So this is, I think, episode like 120,000 or 128 or something like that. We've been doing this a long, long time, but you'll notice that my colleague today is not the infamous Dave Russell. With me today is Emilee Tellez. Thanks for joining the show.
Thank you, Jason. Happy to be here.
So Emilee, we've been for the last 12 weeks or so talking about different aspects and insights from the Data Protection Trends Report for 2023. For those that have been tuning in late, largest industry report of its kind, 4,200 unbiased IT leaders across 28 countries around the world, all looking at macro trends in data protection. But what I want to do this week, so this is actually the last week of the DPR data for 2023, because we're all starting to get ready for VeeamON. We've got some new data coming out for that event. But I want to do something a little special on this one in that normally we just talk about the data and we try to keep the Veeam parts out of it until the very end. But I've invited you this week because I love BCDR. And while as a parent you should never have a favorite child, I will say as a Veeamer, I do have a favorite product, and that is Veeam Orchestrator, which just came out with version 6. So what I'd like to do is set the stage a little bit with a little bit of data, and then have you walk us through what do you see from the data. You come from the Veeam field, so you know what customers have been asking for and what partners are asking for, and then please tell us all the fantabulous wonderment that is VRO6. But let's start with setting the table. Let's start with some data along the way. By the way, please tell us where you're from. And if you have questions about orchestration, remediation from ransomware, remediation from any other kind of major disaster, or just anything else about wine, any of those topics, you should make sure to talk to Emilee about, weigh in, and also let us know where you're from while you're at it. You can see the map is up as well. I hail from the great state of Texas, along with our social media team. Production is out of Georgia. Emilee, we are claiming you out of Arizona.
I'm out of Arizona.
All right. Texas education. We're not good at geography, especially west of us. But our mission in life is to turn the rest of the globe green. So please feel free to let us know where you're from. All right. So let's set the stage. Let's bring up some first data. So one of my favorite questions in the data protection report looked at when organizations were asked, what does modern data protection look like? What does innovative data protection look like? Now, we've highlighted a couple things that are on this screen. Certainly for a lot of organizations in 2023, number one thing they got to solve for is ransomware, right? So having backup that integrates with cyber technologies is a big deal. But I like the fact that 37%, so a little over 1 in 3 organizations, said orchestration needs to be part of a modern data protection solution. There's another lens on this that's worth pointing out, though, and this is the one we're going to focus on. So the whole idea of orchestration should be, how do I reduce the time necessary for remediation? And the example that I typically give, I teach the first aid merit badge to Boy Scouts, and we teach your likelihood to survive is based on shrinking the time between snakebite and hospital. Right? If you can shrink that time, you too might actually live. And so how do organizations actually shrink time? That's what this data is showing us, is what are the failover mechanisms. Now, Dave and I poke fun at this quite a bit. 30% of respondents said they're going to reconfigure their environment during the crisis. In Texas, we would say, bless their hearts. 52% say they're going to write scripts. And Emilee, last time I wrote a script was the day after I installed the app, and I usually never got back to it again. And so it is just as good as that. And then there's the 18%, so let's call it 1 in 6 organizations that are using orchestrated workflow. First of all, does this surprise you? And then let's talk about the better answer.
It doesn't, right? So, I've been in the field for better half of 5+ years. And I can't tell you the amount of times that, I would run exercises with just different end users. What would you do if you came in tomorrow and half of your environment wasn't accessible? What would be your first step in order to get things back up online? And a lot of them will just kind of blank stare and say, well, I didn't really think about that, right? Or you have other people that would say, well, if I came in and there was a ransomware attack, I would hit the big red button and do an auto shut off of everything in the environment, which is probably not the best choice, right? But in those situations, it's an emergency, you panic. And that's one thing that we want to kind of change, right? Is what do you do when you're under pressure to make sure that you're going to reduce the risk of mistakes that could potentially happen when you're already in a really bad scenario?
Right, right. So one of the things that I think a lot of folks make the mistake of, especially for the 30% of organizations that think they're going to manually reconfigure, is you're assuming that your entire expert staff showed up for work the next day, right? And there's a lot of different kinds of crises where that's actually not going to happen. Fire, flood, earthquake, in those kind of cases, your IT team may not be able to make it into the office. And so now the expert that you were thinking was going to restitch things by hand, they're at home, right? Working on, stitching together their living room or their kitchen or their kids' rooms, et cetera. So instead, what if we took all of that expertise and whatever they would have thought about putting into a scripting file, what if we would actually put that into some orchestration instead? What's our answer for that?
Yeah, and that comes with Veeam Recovery Orchestrator. So Veeam Recovery Orchestrator just sits on top of Veeam Backup and Replication in Veeam 1. So this allows us to be, more fluid when it comes to identifying better disaster recovery planning, documenting those steps that are going to be necessary to get things back up online as quick as possible, reducing the amount of risk that could be or could happen during that time of an outage. But then on top of that, it's also testing to verify that those recovery plans that you put in place were actually going to work, right? The last thing you want to do instead of a disaster is go to initiate a recovery plan. And now all of a sudden, right, you don't have the right licensing over at your secondary sites. You have types of different outages that might be going on with hardware. Maybe there wasn't enough resources available for the applications you wanted to spin up. So this helps to mitigate any of that type of risk that could potentially happen during an outage when you go to attempt to failover, to know that your recovery plan is actually going to work and you know what your definite RPO and RTO is going to be, and it's fully documented, always being kept up to date.
Yeah, for the folks at home that may not have spent much time beyond just VBR, right? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of folks on here that are going to be predominantly Veeam customers already. Many of them are using the Veeam backup replication product, but maybe not necessarily the orchestration lens. Write this down. Orchestrator basically unlocks the promise of everything that you get in VBR. Right. Emily, you said it's built on top of that VBR engine. And so everything that you want it to do, it's the difference between you get a stock version of a car and an amateur driver, and then you soup up the car and you put a professional behind the wheel. That same car just is going to rock more. Right. And that's really what Orchestrator is about. It's unlocking the promise and the potential for the kinds of recovery that you bought VBR for along that way. So and let's talk about a little bit more of the data and then kind of dig into some of the things that I'm super excited about with VBR. Actually, we just got a note from the producer. I think we're ready for the map. So let's take a look at where folks are coming in from. Now it's kind of a cool shape, kind of like a goblet coming up out of the Americas, which is kind of nice. So, my neighbors to the south down in Mexico are representing this morning. Also to the north, we got Colorado in the house. So hello there, or as some of us in Texas refer to as Texas North. We've also got friends in Ohio coming in. Argentina, always glad when they come in. Those folks need no food. Let's see if we take a look over there. Looks like Uganda is in the house. Way to represent for the continent. So thank you very much for joining. And then India is representing as well. So yeah, so please keep it coming. Please let us know where you're from that. And let's see how much of the world we can turn green along the way. So let's talk about some of the data here that I think is going to highlight some of the things we're most excited about for Orchestrator version 6. The first one is when organizations were asked about where do you want to recover, right? And so, for example, in many cases, we look at, enterprises have always thought, I'm going to recover data center to data center. So, East Coast to West Coast, Americas to Europe, or whatever that combination might be. For 2023, I think it's interesting. Only 54% of organizations said that their DR site, I'm going to put that in air quotes, is actually physical infrastructure within an on-premise data center of theirs. 46%, nearly half, are saying, I'm going to recover to the cloud. Now, by the way, there's another nuance in here. Only 16% are going to recover from on-prem backups. Even the majority of the folks that are recovering on-prem are recovering from a cloud copy of their data. This is pretty fantastic. You've been seeing, I mean, what are customers been telling you for the last couple of years? And let's talk about how we address that.
Yeah, and I think this is all relevant to the digital transformation, right? Something that we've talked about since 2015, 2016 was the
Sure.
idea of cloud first and everybody moving workloads into the cloud. And I could tell you with the pandemic, we just saw that be accelerated, where now we're seeing majority of customers have a good hybrid environment where they have a half of their environment is running inside of some type of cloud, whether that's a hyperscaler or if that's going to be um, on the edge, right? There's so many different options that are out there for end users to be able to utilize. But on top of that, it makes things harder when it comes to building BCDR strategies, right? Because usually you have different application owners that are going to be owning those workloads wherever they may be living, and they're leveraging their own tools that might not be known to the other users that are within the organization. So it makes BCDR a little bit harder to kind of grab hold of, but that's the beauty of Orchestrator, is giving us that capability to kind of see where all of our workloads are living and build plans for all of them.
So I like how you said that. Is I think the other side of that coin is, think about all the, say, mid-sized organizations, commercial institutions that have never had a secondary site, right? For
Right.
them, BCDR was never an option. Not that they didn't rely on their data just as much. In fact, arguably even more, because they didn't have the expertise in-house to help try to recover, but they didn't have a second site, which means they didn't have a DR plan. And so now, with so many organizations now being able to leverage the cloud as their DR plan, they don't have to maintain it. They can only pay for it when they need it. For all those reasons, all of a sudden it unlocks some capabilities that are there. So for those folks who haven't worked with Orchestrator before, we love both sides of this argument, right? We love the on-premise recovery scenarios. We love the cloud scenarios. Can you walk us through, how does Orchestrator first work on-prem, which I think is, the basis, and then we'll talk about how does that differ when we recover to a cloud.
Sure. So Orchestrator was built again fundamentally off of Veeam backup and replication. So ideally, when we are talking to end users about BCDR, it was really that site-to-site replication. We have a workload. We've already known that this is critical and important to our business. We've replicated that using Veeam backup and replication, or maybe we're using our storage like HPE or NetApp to replicate those volumes over to a secondary site. And Veeam Recovery Orchestrator just sits on top and captures all of those workloads and is able to document and give us some ready plans that we can run in the moment's notice if we need it. So that was the basis of Orchestrator where it started. With version 6, it just opened up the capabilities to all end users, right? No longer do I have to have a secondary site that's running VMware that has hardware, CPU that I have to manage all the networking of, right? Now I actually have the opportunity to leverage either the cloud or leverage backups to perform my restores. So now I can also take backups from Windows agents, from Linux agents, for other vSphere virtual machines that maybe they weren't part of that replication scenario originally, but now we're in a scenario where 70% of our environment is completely corrupted and we need to be able to bring that all online. We can actually recover from those backups, make that part of the recovery plan, and have that same type of orchestration where we're able to fail over for those VMs that are being replicated, but then also perform direct restores for any of those backups as vSphere virtual machines or as Azure virtual machines. So we could tell a quick story here of an end user who had a secondary DR site. they were part of a ransomware event. Their secondary DR site was no longer available to them just due to a chain of custody and investigation that was happening. And their only place that they could recover to ended up being the cloud. And they had to run direct restores into Azure in order to get their data up online as quick as possible to be able to continue business. So in that scenario, right, Azure became their secondary DR site through direct restores.
So I love the fact that that particular customer scenario highlights, really a best practice in BCDR, and that is the fact that you should assume that depending on the kinds of crisis that you have, not only is your production infrastructure impacted, but it's possible as part of your recovery plan, you should have multi-tiers of where that recovery is going to go to, because it might be that your secondary infrastructure might also be affected. That's particularly true like in a data center type environment where depending on, how pervasive that was, it permeated across your WAN, not just your LAN, and affected that secondary infrastructure. We hear all kinds of horror stories where, you hear about a ransomware attack that comes in over the weekend. You come in Monday to say, okay, I'm going to wipe the drives and start over. And by the time you get there, some nice folks with Kevlar and badges are there, and they have yellow tape around that data center. You don't get that metal. Right. And then, of course, the days of being able to call your local distributor and saying, hey, I need new metal and I need to be here in the morning. Supply chain is not your friend in this case. So being able to actually have cloudy recovery options, I think, is really interesting. There's a couple other things, though, that you mentioned, though, that I think is probably worth making sure that we land. One of them is I love the idea that we're not just talking about VMs anymore. You're also talking about physical servers that are protected from Windows or Linux. So for things like branch offices, for things like retail, for things like manufacturing, where they may not actually have whole secondary infrastructure, you could actually fail over just the one machine that's in that environment over into a cloud state along the way. It's also worth pointing out, doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of difference to me between we just had a bad event happen and I'm going to bring this machine up in a cloud versus I just want to change my cost model and I now want to run that production workload in a cloud. There's not a whole lot of difference between DR and migration. Is that oversimplification?
No, DR to me, when we're talking about going to Azure, is direct restore, which essentially, if you were to look at that from a migration perspective, that is the exact same thing you're going to do as well, right? I'm going to take my backups and I'm going to do a lift and shift of some type into Azure in order to get those workloads there. So, no, absolutely. And we've had customers that have said, okay, we did this direct restore as a plan C option. But
Right.
since we've done it and we've gone through and we made changes and we made sure that it runs at a more healthy state, we're just going to leave it there. It makes
Yeah.
more sense for us to run inside of Azure than to try to bring that all back down on-prem.
Oh yeah, we see that one a lot, right? And it's no different than, hey, you had a spare tire or you had a flat, you swapped out the tires. Like, do I really have to put the original back on? This seems like we're still going down the street pretty well. The other thing, and I think this is an area that a lot of folks underestimate. You mentioned that folks can use their backups and not just replicas as part of their DR plan, and I think so. I come from a DR world before I joined Veeam, and one thing I think a lot of folks underestimate is when you think about other kinds of disasters, so fire, flood, earthquake, as an example, when you have a flood, the servers that you need to recover are the ones that are dripping right now, right? But the good part is that the replica that you created milliseconds or minutes ago, that's good data powered up someplace else, right? If you have fire, right, you fail over the ones that are crispy. And the data from a few minutes before the fire hit is good data. When you have a ransomware event, you should pretty much plan on the data that was a few seconds old in the replication set. That is not good data, right? You're just going to be reintroducing the same problem a few seconds behind. It's like rewinding a movie 10 seconds. It's going to play the same way 10 seconds later. And so being able to actually recover from previous points in time, we call them backups, as opposed to just a real-time replica, actually is a huge consideration and something that a lot of DR scenarios really underestimate. I'm delighted by the fact that backups are part of your DR plan. This seems fairly new and something that I think a lot of folks underestimate.
It is, right? And I think if you think about it, right, a lot of customers did rely on their backups for disaster recovery. Now we're just making it easier for you to be able to have an actual documented process that actually shows you this is the process to recover from those backups, right? Because it's easier when you've replicated virtual machines, you've done the workload assessments, you know how to simply go through and power on a virtual machine because it's just sitting in that standby and ready state. That's the hard part has already been done and configured. You're just powering it on. But when it comes to backups are completely different, right? If we're trying to do a P2V conversion, have we tested that before? Do we know it's going to work? Things around, the types of workloads that we're going to be powering on first and spinning them up from backups. When was the last time we tested some of those?
Fair.
So this helps to kind of enhance that process and ensure that when customers are going through a full-on disaster recovery attack or trying to remedy one of those, that they'll be able to do so leveraging those backups and make sure that they're going to be a successful attempt every time.
And by the way, I'm not trying to bash the other kinds of data protection. When you think about data protection as an umbrella, depending on the kind of workload and the sensitivity for data loss you have, you absolutely should be thinking about backups for the sake of previous versions and long-term retention. You absolutely should be thinking about replication and the form of that we all call continuous data protection. You should be thinking about snapshots, right? So there's nothing faster than reverting a previous version than a snap that can just simply reallocate some blocks. I mean, so that umbrella, that paradigm of data protection, you're balancing RPO and RTO across each of those four mechanisms, and there are gives and takes on each of those across that spectrum of data protection. And speaking of across the spectrum, let's take a look at across the map here. Let's go ahead and bring up, look at that, the world's turning green. All right, so what do we got? So we got Canada's in the house, and a couple more states have piled on, so thank you for those. And if we go over to the old country, we got Germany's in and Denmark, so thank you all for joining. Portugal, and I'm pretty sure that's Hungary along the way. Let's see, there we go. Whenever my Brazilian friends join their friends in Argentina, that whole continent just turns green, so thank you for that. And also to our friends in Uruguay to kind of fill that out, so appreciate that. And we got Morocco and Zambia, looks like Nigeria, I think I see UAE right on the edge, and Uzbekistan is also in, which is just kind of fun to say, just for the record. All right, so, and I think I just saw Nigeria just popped in on the African Peninsula as well, so thank you all for joining. All right, so one of the things that we were just mentioning before was, we talked about how the caveat of replicas versus backups is you don't want to reintroduce infection back into the environment along the way. That was actually one of the other questions. Now, this question actually comes from our ransomware 2022 report as opposed to the data protection 23 report we've been covering right now. Spoiler alert. VMON last year was when the Ransomware 22 report debuted. I wonder what could debut at VMON 23. Anyway, just hypothetically speaking. That said, let's look at last year's data. So when organizations were asked, how do you ensure that the data that you're restoring with is actually going to be clean? Now, I'm just going to point out, I think 54% of folks got it wrong. And I know data is data, but 54%, right? 7% said they had no way of verifying. 11% said they restored it and then monitored. Well, if that had worked, they wouldn't have gotten infected in the first place. 36% said we restored back and immediately scanned it really fast, right? Which again, just seems wow. Right. But I do, however, like the 46% of folks that said, like any other contagion, we're going to drop it into a sandbox. We're going to use a different kind of scanning technology to make sure it's clean. And then in a staged mechanism, recover that back. Now, and we've been talking about staged restore as a mechanism with Orchestrator for quite a while. But in Orchestrator 6, we've added some new capabilities around what we're calling clean DR. Can we walk through what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So like you mentioned, Orchestrator is just extending that same functionality that's built into backup and replication. So now we actually have our backup and replication server, right? And we have our backups that are being stored on that backup repository. Orchestrator is aware of that being backup replication server. We take our backup and we mount it, and then we go ahead and run AV from the mount server that we have available. Now, antivirus that we support, Microsoft Windows Defender out of box, ESET, Symantec, those are going to be the ones, but pretty much any AV software vendor that has a command line interface can be added in as an option for you to be able to scan your backups with.
Hey, Em,
So
hold that thought for a second, because I want to make sure that folks are understanding what we're doing now. So first and foremost, by the way, the idea of integrating a backup scanner, again, because Orchestrator is built on top of VBR, this was already native, right? So you already can automate, I want to do a scan as part of my backups, right? So this is just doing the rest of the process and doing it from the restore as well. One thing I would also point out to you, for those organizations that are leveraging a partner, whether it's a partner that's traditionally in the environment like a reseller, I'm a huge fan of backup as a service and DR as a service organizations, especially those who also have a cyber practice, right? Because if they have a cyber competency and they actually know how to spell DRAS, then what you'll find is you can use whatever scanner you wanted on the production environment, but a good DRAS provider with a cyber competency, they'll use a different kind of scanner to give you a different kind of way to make sure nothing is coming back into the environment. So I just want to make sure folks understand, think about that scanner and scanners being options or detections. I know it's not always called a scanner anymore, but you get the idea from there. Okay, so we've mounted the data in the from the repository live, because that's what we do. That's our incident recovery feature. We've exposed it to a detection technology to make sure that it's clean. So there's a couple different things that can come from this, right?
correct. Yeah. So when it's running inside of that isolated sandbox, not only are we going to do the checks to actually make sure that your virtual machine is going to come back online and is actually going to work, but we have the follow-up processes that will go through with it. So if no infections are found, right, because we've updated that antivirus definition, we know what we should be looking for as far as any type of malicious content from that backup and now that live machine. Nothing's found, great. You could go ahead and we could proceed to this restore and allow that to be recovered inside of our environment. If we find an infection, we have the option now to extend it out to say, okay, go ahead and move to the next restore point, which in secure restore or in our sure backup, when we used to run that, you would have to choose a very specific restore point. Well, with now with Orchestrator, we could choose up to 10. So automatically, it's going to stop the restore process with Orchestrator, and it's just going to go to the next available restore point and start doing the scan all over again. So it's going to start that scan process until it finds a clean available restore point for us to recover from. Now, if we don't find any clean restore point, you could still recover the data into that environment, but of course, we'll recommend that you don't connect it to the network, so that way you're not risking spreading that infection to any of your other clean virtual machines. But also, you have the option to also recover this to a quarantine environment within Azure. So if you have your Azure environment set up, you can create a separate network, which will be called the quarantine network. And we can go ahead and stand up that virtual machine inside of this quarantine zone where you can run your additional tests, do any data changes, whatever you want to do from an analytics perspective inside of that quarantine zone. Again, with no risk of it infecting your production environment.
Love that. So we have a problem. There is more Orchestrator stuff that we could cover, and we are almost out of time. So, Em, I'm thinking that you and I need to do a full hour webinar where we can really talk through this stuff. I know you had some screen shares we want to kind of talk through as well. And then I would make a plug for the last piece of any real DR strategy needs to, or maybe it's the first piece. Actually, it's the ongoing piece, is documentation. Dang it. You know, you need to know how did the testing work? Did the testing happen? Where did it break? Where can you improve? And we don't have the time, but I do want to make sure folks know significant advancements in and real unique disruption in how we derive documentation for BCDR, not only for operational planning, but also for regulatory compliance as well. So to wrap up our time for today, and again, thank you so much for being part of the session. We need to do a webinar, dang it. So on Thursday this week, we are going to do a TechBytes takeover from the women of Veeam On. Now, because you got represented today, the rest of your lady colleagues that are going to be, or some of them are going to be on Thursday. So we've got Corinne is going to be on, Kirsten's going to be on, Leah's going to be on, talking about the all the areas that they're driving and leading within our VMon event. Next Tuesday, Dave got this week off. I'm taking next week off. And so Dave is going to be on with Kasten looking at some of the new momentum in containers and data protection as well. And then VMon is 6 weeks away. 6 weeks from VMon. If you have not already, take a look at the promo code. So you can go to VO Miami 1001, get 10% off. Also, by the way, you can attend online virtually for free as well. And thanks again for joining, and everyone else, thanks for watching. Check out this VMon promo.